welcome you and thank you for coming out on such a dreary afternoon. But in a lot of ways, as Victoria had said, I did do 92 books. This is my 92nd. I actually have done a series of books, not just on the neighborhoods of Boston, the city itself, but things on such things as the Back Bay, Beacon Hill, Jordan Marsh, the Christmas Tree Shop, Baker's Chocolate, the Great Boston Fire of 1872. They're all fascinating, but I had a financial career. I was treasurer of a company in Boston for 40 years. I taught at Boston University Metropolitan College evenings for 30 years. So I was always intrigued with history, but it never made money. So the concept was the more one wrote, of course, the more one would think that he would make royalties. Well, I get enough to go to Europe once a year. But the whole concept is the type of book that I like to write is something about our shared memory. And you might remember Jordan Marsh, and you might remember Baker Chocolate. But in a lot of ways, S.S. Pierce is something that was really one of the premier companies of Boston. And when it was founded in 1831, it was just a corner grocery store. But the whole concept was it would be run by 4 generations of family known as Peirce, not Pierce, who would actually purvey, in some ways, the finest imported goods, as well as great domestic goods. Well, in 1831, Samuel Stillman Pierce, because he was a Pierce in 1831, and his partner, Eldad Worcester, quote, started out by wholesaling provisions to the ships that crowded what was then a very busy Boston harbor. But soon enough, Pierce was bartering with his ship captains. And of course, they often exchanged provisions for the delicacies that they would bring to Boston from faraway ports, unquote. Pierce said, quote, I may not make money, but I shall make a reputation, unquote. Well, the portrait dated to the early 1880s. They were posthumous, and there were over 15 of them painted. But on the lower right-hand side, you can see his first store at the corner of Court and Tremont Streets in the old West End of Boston. Now, during that period of time, Samuel Stillman Pierce was known as a purveyor of fancy goods and potent libations to Victorian Bostonians. He catered to the carriage trade and created a company that involved 4 generations of the Peirce family in its successful operations. With its own coat of arms adorning distinctive red label on canned goods and the largest line of privately packed fancy goods in the world, S.S. Pierce sold its delicacies not only through 8 New England stores of its own, but also through 3,500 distributors across the United States and by mail order worldwide. In that instance, Boston in the early 19th century was changing. Boston was a town founded in 1630 by Puritans seeking religious freedom. It was also an 800-acre peninsula that jutted out into Boston Harbor. It didn't change throughout the 17th and 18th century, but in the early 19th century, and this painting dates to 1801, we saw State Street, formerly King Street before the Revolution, as the demarcation side of North End on the right and the South End on the left. The old State House, built in 1712, is not only the seat of provincial government, but this area would change from a town built of wood into a city built of red brick thanks to Charles Bulfinch. By 1801, Boston's population was 20,000 people, primarily descendants of the original settlers. But as you can see here in a map of 1845, Boston saw infilling or topographical changes, such as, of course, the increased land on the lower right-hand side, which was Dorchester Neck, now South Boston, the infilling of the West End, and the projection of the infilling of the Back Bay. Boston continued to grow, not just through matriculation, but immigration, so that by 1870, Boston had a population of 250,000 people, of which 1/2 were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Well, in a lot of ways, Samuel Stillman Pierce, by 1837 pronounced Peirce, opened his first store known as Worcester and Pierce at the corner of Tremont and Court Streets in Boston's Old West End in 1831. The building was formerly the Customs House prior to the Revolution, and President George Washington stayed here when he visited the town of Boston in 1789. This is a print from Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, Boston's first illustrated newspaper, and it dates to 1852. In the very center, of course, is the store, and you can see along Tremont Street on the right-hand side, the Boston Theater, King's Chapel, not only the Parker House, but even, as we see here, a streetscape that was once residential and now commercial. In this way, by 1841, his partner, Eldad Worcester, would retire from the business. He moved to Quincy and opened a general store there. But the company became known as Samuel S. Peirce. And the whole concept was, it's 1837 that he changed the name, and we'll see why. This advertisement showed that he had a new store, corner of Tremont and Court. They offered choice teas, foreign fruits, French and German wines, English and American porter, Scotch and American ale, Havana cigars, English, French, and India syrups, and choice family groceries. It wasn't just local sourced items, it was also things that were imported from Europe. And Samuel S. Peirce's catalog of 1847 stated, quote, particular attention was paid to Navy and merchantmen's cabin stores, unquote. Requests of the 19th century were heard for kangaroo tail soup, truffle lark, and reindeer tongue, which were made by Bostonians, according to C. Lester Walker, who wrote an article for the Reader's Digest. According to that article, the store might sell annually, quote, 5,000 tureens of pâté de foie gras, 4,500 jars of caviar, and 9,500 cans of mushrooms, unquote. And that it also sells crepe Suzette, English lime marmalade, English French frog's legs, and costly terrapin stew. And the firm even stocks escargot and boxes of pink French snail shells to cook them in, unquote. And this is 1850 to 1860, so many of our Bostonian ancestors really did have a palate. But on the right-hand side was another new advertisement. This dated to 1847. It would not only show that it had choice teas and foreign fruits, which were out of season because they arrived at Boston Harbor, but it was something that people looked forward to. Well, S.S. Peirce was an astute businessman, and it was said that his business sagacity was of high order, his integrity unquestioned, his success the result of close application and careful supervision. The diversity, quality, and indeed rareness of the foods offered by Peirce was unexcelled, and some Bostonians claim that S.S. Peirce had introduced more new food products to the American public than any other United States grocer. The first recorded sale of canned corn was made by Peirce in 1848. Peirce had sold Singapore pineapple before Hawaiian was ever heard of, and sun-ripened canned peaches, brook trout from Iceland, and even rattlesnake meat, a very good source of protein. But seen in the photograph on the far right-hand side was the store, and it was located in Scully Square. Now, Scully Square would eventually become quite the red light district. But in this photograph of the 1850s, it was the terminus for not only streetcars and stagecoaches arriving in Boston, but also departing. William Scully lived in the house in the center. It says S.D. Bates Printer, but he would be the man who was the conductor. On the right-hand side was, of course, Center Plaza today, and on the left-hand side is what is today Boston City Hall Plaza. Well, if you ordered from S.S. Peirce and Company, you would actually see horses arriving at your house 6 days a week. These were Percheron horses, and the Percheron horses were specially bred just for him, and they were a gray dappled mare. The wagon, as you see on the right, was painted flame red. It had gold letters and the spurious family coat of arms. So you can imagine, if you were unable to carry your groceries home, they'd be delivered free of charge within the city daily, but eventually as far as Brookline or Milton on specific days. The whole concept was he was importing not just fine fruits and different groceries, he was also importing things such as Madeira and port. They'd been known in Boston since the 17th century. They are the wines that you would serve at funerals, potent, and of course, delicious. But this Madeira that would come from Madeira was actually Cossack Gordon and Company, And in the midst of doing research for this, I went to Madeira, visited them, and I was so happy that I could deduct the trip because it was part of my research. But Madeira was something that had been settled by the English and began to make a fine Madeira. What they did was to create twice across Madeira, and it was offered by S.S. Pierce in the mid-19th century. It was from Messrs. Cossett, Gordon and Company on the island of Madeira, and some of the wines were typical Madeira, such as Bual. But the idea was that twice across Madeira was Madeira that was shipped in barrels. They were on clipper ships, and the clipper ship had to cross the equator twice, and with the gentle rocking of the ship, it was thought to create a mellow, fine Madeira, usually at least 2 years old, just in the barrel, and the twice across Madeira sold twice the price of any other Madeiras that he sold. Seen here in a photograph, and this dates to 1858, it shows that the first floor, and what's always the ground floor of the companies of the future, would actually have 2 entrances. But directly above, though Pierce did own the building, they had not only architectural offices, law firms, and even accounting firms. So it was a major building at the corner of Tremont and Court Streets that provided the wherewithal for many people's culinary expertise. But in this photograph, which is still owned by the family, it's an amber tin type that is actually from 1845. It shows Ella Maria Teresa Wallace and Samuel Stillman Pierce, and they were married in 1836. And to distinguish him from his cabinet-making family in Dorchester Lower Mills, the new Mrs. Pierce began to pronounce the name Peirce, which, of course, has continued into the present century. She wanted to be a Mrs. Peirce, not a Mrs. Pierce, because the cabinet maker and family were not high enough in their social status. But as you can see, what they were doing were selling goods, which in that instance disqualified her as she was English. As sales, they were doing quite well. Initially, they had lived in the Old West End, but by 1852, they had bought a house on Union Park in Boston's South End. The South End had been infilled beginning in the 1840s, and the area was laid out in a plan that had been chosen by Charles Bulfinch. You had areas such as a park in the center. It emulated Lewisburg Square on Beacon Hill and Pemberton Square on Beacon Hill. And you had row houses that connected on both sides and created a very urbane and sophisticated area. Well, the family bought number 5 Union Park, and they would live there right through to the 1890s. But Samuel Stillman Peirce was known as a purveyor of fancy goods and potent libations to Victorian Bostonians. He catered to the carriage trade and created a company that involved 4 generations of the Peirce family in its successful operations. With its own coat of arms adorning a distinctive red label on canned goods, and the largest line of privately packed fancy goods in the world, S.S. Pierce sold its delicacies through its 8 stores. Well, in that instance, he died in 1880, and his eldest son, Wallace Lincoln Peirce, would actually become president. Peirce was the son of Samuel Stillman and Ella Maria Teresa Wallace Peirce, and served as president of S.S. Pierce and Company. He was educated at Boston English High School and then entered business in 1871 under his father of the firm of S.S. Pierce and Company, importers and dealers in groceries. In 1874, he was admitted to partnership in the firm, and in 1894, when the business was incorporated as S.S. Pierce Company, Wallace Lincoln Peirce became president of the corporation and held this office until his death. He was a very grand man. He built 330 Beacon Street in the Back Bay. His summer house was in Milton, whereas his father's summer house was in Dorchester. He was a man who transformed the company between his father's death and his death in 1920 into one of the leading purveyors of fine goods in the city. Eventually, the old building had been demolished. It wasn't owned by that point by the family. It was actually owned by the Hemingway Trust. They decided to create this new high-rise, which actually was 7 stories in height and designed by Winslow and Weatherall. But of course, when the building was completed, S.S. Pierce and Company moved into the ground floor. So you can see this area of the edge of Scully Square and a statue of Governor Winthrop in the center by Richard Greenough as a good example of something that was a densely built up commercial area. And in that way, the company had done so well that they decided to have the first suburban annex. Now, we don't think of Boston in such ways as having suburban areas right in the city, but the Back Bay was a newly created area from downtown Boston. And Wallace Lincoln Purse said of the company in 1911 that, quote, "The success of the house is due more than anything else to the character of its founder. It has been comparatively easy for us to build up the business on the reputation he left us," unquote. Well, the new West End store would be built at Copley Square. But when it was built, it was really an art square because it was named after the Museum of Fine Arts that was located there until it moved to the Fenway in 1911. Seen on the left-hand side, this building was designed by S. Edwin Toby, again, on the ground floor on both sides of both Dartmouth and Huntington Avenue would actually be window displays. And directly above were things such as law offices, accounting offices, the beginning of what was to be Curry College, Emerson College, and many different dance troupes. In this way, the building, which survived until the early 1950s, was a great example of this Germanic Romanesque structure built of not only brownstone, but terracotta. And you can see on the right-hand side was Holden White Purse. He was the youngest son of S.S. Pierce, and he became the manager of the Copley Square store, but he died young in 1890. So with a building in downtown Boston and now a building in Copley Square catering to the new people building houses in Boston's Back Bay, this became one of the leading purveyors in the city. This photograph is from 1903, and it shows in the very center, with his hat at a rakish angle, Wallace Lincoln Purse. His 2 sons, Walworth and, of course, Winthrop on the right-hand side, are on both sides, and these were the different people that were major to the company's success. These photographs, unfortunately, were in an aluminum photograph that had fallen to pieces, but was given to me by a woman who used to be my mail person. She said, "You don't recognize me." I looked at her and I said, "When was I home during the business day?" But she had given me over 100 photographs, and it showed people and the things they did, including the building they would eventually move to across from the store where they had started. This building was called the Tremont Building. It was built in 1893. It was on the site of the Tremont House Hotel, adjacent to the Granary Burying Ground. And when it was built, and designed again by Winslow and Weatherall, the ground floor was S.S. Pierce and Company, but the upper floors were mostly law offices. It was here that they began to cater to Beacon Hill, whereas the Back Bay store catered to the Back Bay. In this store, at the foot of what is today Beacon Street and Tremont Street, is a great example of different departments. This is the wine department. Yes, they did have domestic wine. They even had wine from California. But much of their wine, over 55% of it, was imported from Europe. These were wine clerks, and surprisingly, they would open a bottle and uncork it so that you could taste the wine before you purchased it. In that way, we began to realize what's better than a glass of port or Madeira or even wine than to have a cigar. And during that period, there were many different Boston manufacturers of cigars, usually with Cuban imported, but you had to realize Connecticut had a huge tobacco crop every year. These were hand-rolled and sold, of course, at the tobacco counter. And in the foreground was their own cigar. It was called the Overland. Overland was used in a lot of different things, including foodstuffs as well as cigarettes. But these individual departments were fully staffed with anywhere from 8 to 12 people, men or women, and they actually knew everything there was that they actually sold. Now, if you weren't able to get to the Beacon Hill store or the Back Bay, they had what was called the Epicure. This started in 1882, and it was a catalog, not only with wonderful articles and illustrations, but a catalog of over 5,000 items when they began that you could actually have shipped to you, whether it was by horse-drawn wagon or say you lived in the hinterlands like Belmont. You might see it arrive by parcel post. But as you can see in this cover, it said the Boston stores was the Tremont Building on Beacon Hill, Cushing Square in the Back Bay. They had a wholesale store on Milk Street and a Brookline store at Coolidge Corner. So this dated to about 1910. And the whole aspect was they also had a group of people, mostly men, that ran the mail order department. Now, granted, you could send a telegraph, you could send a first-class letter, but if you didn't call to do your weekly order, it was the duty of these men to call you to find out why you had not placed your order for that week. Well, it was important. It said that they had telegraph, telephone, or mail orders, and handled by an expert corps of salesmen. Now, of course, you wanted to stock your house, as it shows on the upper left-hand side, your Back Bay house, your summer house, your country house, and your beach house. Well, you always wanted to make sure you had S.S. Pierce on the shelf. But they also did things such as the New England Seashore and Country, home, club, or camp. Supplies were shipped express daily to all points by the house of S.S. Pierce. So not only did you have it going by ship or by railroad, you even saw this as something that they would actually bring in things by clipper ship. Now, since the days of the clipper ship, Boston's S.S. Pierce has preserved its famous label for the best in foods and delicacies to be found throughout the world. And whether brown bread or Bombay duck, cranberries or crepe amandine, extracts or escargot, maple syrup or marrons, Welsh rarebit or wild rice, or cigarettes or tobacco, the name S.S. Pierce on the label is your guarantee of excellence and value. They said, quote, "We know you will recognize the distinctive label of the products bearing the S.S. Pierce label." And this, which is a beautiful cover, the gilt is actually tarnished, was the prices for Havana cigars, cigarettes, and tobacco. This was 20 pages long. So you began to realize they were offering a wide variety of not only goods, but at different prices. And of course, it was usually less expensive to buy in bulk. One of the things they offered that people really had known since 1831 was tea. And on the left-hand side is a box, it would have been wooden, covered in rattan, that would actually show, and I get this, extra choicest English breakfast congu. This was a very delicious tea. They came in 40-pound boxes, and in this way, from China, they actually would arrive by the dozens. Now, on the right-hand side was an advertisement. This was in the Epicure, and it showed that not only did they sell tea, but look at the amount of teas. Darjeeling tea, flower pekoe tea, oolong, Ceylon, Assam, English breakfast, Orinda. It was incredible. There were upwards of 40 different types of tea. And if you had a specific brand, it was kept on file. So all you had to do was say, send me a pound of my tea. And people would do it. But seen here in a close-up, and again, these were all from the Epicure, and they were full-page color advertisements, it was something that allowed you to have anything that was available. And some of them were really quite expensive. One of the ones that I love to read about is the Tsarina tea. Now, this special blend of tea was named in honor of Alexandra Fyodorovna, seen on the left, Empress of Russia as the spouse of Nicholas II, the last ruler of the Russian Empire, from their marriage in 1894 until his abdication in 1917. No idea why they had a Russian tea, but this tea for £1 sold for $5 in 1900, which was a tremendous sum of money. So it must have been quite good. But they also offered coffee. Now, SS Pierce Mocha and Java coffee was a custom blend designed to resemble history's first coffee blend. It is not a flavored coffee, but one inspired by the original blend of Yemen mocha and estate Java beans, hence the name. In fact, the word mocha in this coffee name has nothing at all to do with chocolate. Mocha used here and in the Yemen mocha coffee refers to the port of Mocha, located on the southwest corner of Yemen. But as you see here, the wonderful wagon with the Percheron horses pulls it from the ship in which it has just arrived. Coffee went the gamut. It wasn't quite as extensive as tea, but one of the coffees they offered was coffee with a K. And coffee was the least expensive coffee they actually offered. Again, 40-pound boxes of coffee beans would arrive. They'd be ground and then placed into these individual tins by the women. Again, this is one of the photographs from 1902. And in that way, you could buy a coffee for only pennies on the dollar compared to the imported coffees. They also made these types: Café d'Invalide. There was Old Government Java, Arabian Mocha, Café de Connoisseur, Universal Brand Coffee, Mulberry Java, and Orinda Coffee. Do you see how coffee is spelled? It's phonetic, but in that way it was the least expensive that you could purchase, but equally good. And of course, why not? Italian olive oil. In this instance, it was the creme de la creme. Now, olive oil was something in a lot of ways that really only came about in the first decade of the 20th century, especially when they began to sell pastas. This was something that was imported from Italy, and actually it was in 1-gallon tins. But they also made things that would actually be swan's down flour and Apollo flour, each served in a 5-pound wooden barrel. You could actually have these shipped to your house. They were much easier to deliver. But you see in the upper portion all sorts of things, such as cleaning and soaps and different things of that sort, that the company offered. So it wasn't just food and delicacies, it was even things that you really did need to stock your house. But one of the things they did offer was imported wine. Now, as early as the 1840s, they had actually made a connection with Deleuze and Fille in France. They were in Bordeaux. They offered clarets and sauternes, but they offered vintage wines as well. Now remember, these wines came by the barrel, and then they would be decanted by the men working in the basement of the SS Pierce store in Cushing Square. Then each of the bottles would be affixed with a label. You can imagine the heady aroma in that basement. But on the right-hand side, they're importing champagne, and of course down below, Madeira. 4 different types of Madeira. So their wine and spirits was the finest available in Boston. Few people could compete. And this was the wine department. Now, when you look at it, you begin to realize it doesn't look like an awful lot. But one bottle would represent 50 that was in storage. So if you wanted to lay down a dozen bottles of fine Madeira for your grandson's 21st birthday party, they would not only do it, have a label made for that boy, as well as store it until his 21st birthday. They were really a full-service company. But of course, by the turn of the 20th century, many of our ancestors were taking the grand tour of Europe. I've always enjoyed macaroni. It's actually called here L&P Macaroni. Now, this was from Sicily. Now, Lagana and Poggiero is still making macaroni in Sicily. I leave in 2 weeks, and I'm actually looking forward to going to Palermo to their actual company, where they serve pasta dishes. But you can see here, most of it was actually what we would call spaghetti. They did make a series of other things. But they also would actually provide glass bottles of not only grated Parmigiano cheese, but Reggiano Parmigiano cheese. So you could make a wonderful Italian meal, and in this instance, many times it was with olive oil and butter, not necessarily tomato sauce. But it was something that was an ethnic addition to the things they offered. And of course, they imported cheese. They did have domestic cheeses made locally in Vermont and even in Maine. Maine actually provided a wonderful Blue Hill Roquefort or blue cheese. We see wonderful things of cheddar from Vermont. But these were all imported from Europe. There was Roquefort cheese, there was Camembert, and of course the different types. And you could buy a piece or you could buy an entire wheel. These advertisements appeared in the Epicure. And even here, a cask of olives is shown, and it contained 180 gallons of imported Queen olives and weighed nearly 1 ton. So once that arrived, the people would actually take the bottles and bottle the individual olives. This was something in some ways that was done on a repetitive basis because they sold tremendously. So if you can imagine, not only fine Madeiras and olives and cheese and pasta, these were things that people became accustomed to. But they also provided here red label, the finest label, bacon, sliced beef, tongue, even Smithfield hams. And again, these were things that were available on a daily basis in the store or to be delivered to you at home. And here, the red label canned fruits and vegetables and the blue brand canned fruits and vegetables. They say the same. They offered white cherries, Bartlett pears, peaches, sliced peaches, apricots, egg plums. But the idea was if it was red label, it was the finest that was available. If it was the blue brand, it was still good, but it was not the red label. And this advertisement said that the red label had only the fanciest, largest, and most flavorful fruits packed under the red label. Our number 3 tin of red label fruits contained 20% more than the size generally described as large. Other tempting red label fruits are peaches, pears, cherries, and plums. But if you have the blue brand, this is the next best grade to red label, but decidedly better quality than any other brand sold elsewhere. Also cherries, apricot, peaches, and pears. You paid accordingly, too. In that instance, people realized they also sold canned soup. Now, seen on the lower right-hand side is Simon Allegri. He was an immigrant from Sicily, and he was quite a well-known cook. He was the soup chef at SS Pierce, and he created soups that made the best material, and showing great care and judgment in the presentation. The clear green turtle soup could be specially mentioned for its delicacy, body, and flavor. And these goods are so far superior to anything of the kind offered for competition as to be entitled to a silver medal. On the left, Allegri had actually done this in Cambridge, and later he perfected it at the Somerset Club. Allegri soups were said to impart the unerring touch of the true culinary artist and is discernible in the seasonings of this soup, at one rich, delicate, and of incomparable flavor. Simon Allegri was the chef at the Somerset Club in Boston for 25 years, and his soups won the silver medal at the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanics Association trade exhibition of 1881. His soups were said to be a superior article made of the best material and showing great care and judgment in the preparation. These soups included green turtle, mock turtle, oxtail, beef tea, mutton broth, petite marmite, chicken gumbo, mulligatawny, vegetable, tomato, pea, and consommé. So as the advertisement says, why employ a chef? Just open a can of Allegri soup. And he also made chicken a la king and also sweetbreads a la princesse. This was unusual. And of course, Allegri died, his widow sold the company to SS Pierce, and they began to actually can it, but still using the Allegri name. They even had a bakery. And this is Crown Prince Olav and Crown Princess Martha of Norway. And they toured the United States in 1939 with the aim of strengthening ties between Norway and the United States. And during their visit to Boston, Crown Prince Olav celebrated his 36th birthday with his wife as a guest of William Appleton Coolidge, a fellow graduate of Balliol College in Oxford at Huntwick, his estate in Topsfield, Massachusetts. Coolidge was a well-known lawyer and financier and had laid on a surprise for his Nordic friend. A huge birthday cake bearing the armorals of the Crown Prince set between two Norwegian flags with 36 candles set around the base. The cake was made at the S.S. Pierce Bakery and decorated by Alice Heath, whose skill in cake decoration was legendary. The cake looks large enough to feed hundreds of people, but the idea was S.S. Pierce made it in 2 days. Lester and Frances Converse Leland lived at 422 Beacon Street in the Back Bay and were traveling to Europe on the White Star Line ship Republic in 1905. A gift basket from S.S. Pierce was sent to them on the ship before sailing. And as you can see, they're sailing October 30th to December 1st, so it had to arrive on time. You can imagine the tempting things that were there, including the Republic that so probably had wonderful things in the dining room. And they also provided all of the canned items for the flying train that operated between Boston and Bangor, Maine. This was a major feature. So you had ships, you had automobiles, you had railroad. The whole concept was S.S. Pierce was doing a multi-million-dollar company even during the Depression. Well, as the company had expanded, they had those two stores, the one on Beacon Hill and one in the Back Bay. But in 1899, they bought out a company known as Coolidge Brothers at Coolidge Corner in Brookline. This building, which is at the corner of Beacon Street and Harvard Avenue, was designed by Winslow and Weatherall, a wonderful stucco building with an enormous tower that actually overlooked much of the area. As Boston began to spread towards Brookline, because of the ease of accessibility, because of the trains and trolleys that would connect downtown Boston, people would look at this as a major store. But by the period of 1915, the horses, who would still be kept right through to the 1930s, were being supplanted by automobiles. And this international truck automobile was something that would now deliver goods. It said the first 100 years, and it had a little intake down below of a man delivering food in a cart, would later be a horse-drawn wagon, and now this wonderful truck. And seen here, it was said of S.S. Pierce and Company in the Boston Directory that, quote, every article is warranted to give perfect satisfaction, or the money will be refunded at once. We are confident to say, however, that this latter alternative has never been resorted to. The proprietors pay strict personal attendance to the purchase and selection of his stock, and inferior articles find no place on his catalog, unquote. Motorized delivery trucks began by the early 1912 period, delivered throughout the Boston area 6 days a week. And seen here, this would actually become the store in the Fenway. They called it Business Central, and it was on Brookline Avenue. Not only did the Kenmore store actually have everything you needed, and of course it also said park your car at the door, but it also had a huge shipping and receiving dock, which is where everything was not only loaded and delivered or brought in to be stocked. This was a major feature because the company, when this opened in 1929, was grossing close to $40 million a year. The catalog, as I said, the epicure, was something that you could actually order everything from cleaning goods, perfumes, powders, as well as foods, wines, and spirits. And the concept was some of the things that arrived were really quite unique. This was a can of S.S. Pierce Red Label beef pot roast. It arrived with vegetables and gravy, and it says heat and serve as a delicious main course for luncheon or dinner, baking powder biscuits, hot cornbread, or a green salad or an appropriate accompaniment. Now, people began to become accustomed to buying a canned dinner, and in this way, it was quite good, but it was also something that was simply heat and serve. They also had S.S. Pierce Red Label Cream Finnan Hattie, a New England favorite prepared on the coast of Maine. Heat in a double boiler and serve hot with baked potato, also delicious on toast, patty shells, or hot cornbread. So not only was cream finnan haddie something you didn't necessarily have to go to a restaurant for, simply buy a can and have it delivered to your home. And by the 1940s, SS Pierce Red Label lasagna in meat sauce. This would never be served by my father's family. But it was something in some ways that, again, carried that aspect of Loggiorno and Poggero's wonderful spaghettis and macaronis from the early century, ready to heat and serve. Delicious. But it was also the fact that salmon and peas, which was available in a can, had been paired in New England on July 4th for centuries because the salmon used to run just as fresh peas came up. Today, if you want salmon, you can buy it year-round, farm-raised from several coasts, including the East, and there's no wild Atlantic salmon left, or buy wild salmon still fished in the Pacific. However, at one time, SS Pierce offered red, blue-black salmon in a can that was part of the Red Label brand. High quality, specially selected salmon was readily available, and the traditional pairing is still appealing, the pink flesh of the rich fish and bright green peas perfectly suited to one another. Did anyone ever have this on July 4th? Yeah, I did. My mother wasn't Italian. But of course, if you had a pet, they also offered pet food. Now down below on the left-hand side it said, Old Trusty, food for the dog. But they also had, as you see here, worth more dog food. Vitamins, minerals, proteins, and it's less than 5 cents per pound. Well, the selection of high-quality foods available for one's best friend included the Old Trusty all-terrier food and Old Trusty tidbits. However, if you love your dog as much as I love my Danny, who's in the car, why wouldn't you feed him Old Trusty Climax, which was made with real beef? So these were things that people realized. It was all service, and it simply was a telephone call. And of course, some of their wines and spirits were legendary. This is Charles Codman, and he was a noted wine connoisseur and worked as a wine specialist at SS Pierce. It was he who dealt with Deleuze and Fee, and he actually dealt with many other companies, not just in France, but Portugal, Madeira, Italy, Switzerland, and many of these things were imported by the barrel. He would then write for the epicure, and he would pair wines to foods that were prepared from SS Pierce foods. So you might have a can of lasagna on the shelf. What type of wine would you serve? Obviously Chianti. But there was also this man, Leslie Chadwick Browning, and he samples a canapé of rainbow trout pâté and beluga caviar served on a garlic puff. I've never had it. Browning was the cuisine authority for SS Pierce and was reputed to have 10,000 recipes and household hints on the tip of his tongue. Browning often wrote a column in the Epicure called Talk About Food, in which he suggested novelty and originality were what really made a woman's reputation as a gracious hostess. But as you can see, all of this was made through SS Pierce's canned foods. And of course, by the 1950s, this man unloads the box, which was a collapsible box, that's being delivered to the Weld House. This was on Bay State Road, and Dr. Weld was a very wealthy man. He lived right through to the 1960s, and he had SS Pierce delivered once a week for his entire life. But during the period of the 50s and 60s, the company, which was again expanding, decided to work with Walter Dorn Teague, who was regarded as a classicist architect and a traditionalist despite a later shift to modern tastes. Teague is recognized as a critical figure in the spread of mid-20th century modernism in America, and he's widely known for his exhibition designs during the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, such as the Ford Building and his iconic product and packaging designs from Eastman Kodak's Bantam Special to the steel-legged Steinway piano. And he designed many of the SS Pierce stores. And seen here, this was a design for a new store in the 1950s by Teague. It was not built, but it gave you the impression, again, of a one-story modernistic structure plate glass windows, illuminated from within. But what was built was this, the Chestnut Hill store on Route 9. Now, during the period of the 1940-50, after World War II, the area that became one of the wealthiest towns in America would see things such as R.H. Stearns and S.S. Pierce opening a suburban store. This building, designed by Teague, had on the ground floor the shop, and it was self-service, and directly above were offices. So as you walked in the door, you would see the things that you could actually purchase. Yes, self-service, wine, spirits, canned goods, but also a wonderful display of cheese or cookies or anything else that you might think you would need. It was not as large as the Back Bay, nor was it large as the Brookline store, but it was modern, upbeat, clean, and an attractive structure. But there was also one here in Belmont. S.S. Pierce opened a store at Cushing Square in Belmont in 1922 at the corner of Common Street and Tupelo Road. John Perkins Cushing, a china-shade merchant, had an estate known as Belmont, from which the town derives its name. S.S. Pierce was in a two-story Colonial Revival building built in 1913 with three distinctive gambrel dormers designed by H. Thaxter Underwood. On the left is Cobb, Bakes, and Yerxa, a competitive business that was later acquired by S.S. Pierce in 1924. Does anybody remember this store? Again, moving to the more affluent suburbs, such as Wellesley, but we'd also see here one in Newton Center. In Newton Center, with this building directly on the left-hand side, S.S. Pierce had the ground floor store, and directly above were professional offices. The company continued to grow with 11 stores, 10 in Massachusetts and 1 in Connecticut. Here on Tremont Street, and this was the one we went to, which was at 144 Tremont Street in the building that later became directly above C. Crawford Hallage, you realize that this was something directly opposite the Boston Common, a self-service store, but you could actually get a variety of goods, including a fresh bakery. But I think one of the biggest things that they did was to build one in West Hartford, Connecticut. The company opened in West Hartford in 1954, and designed by Walter Dorwin Teague Associates, it was a popular destination for those seeking specialty items. Don Cake remembered that, quote, before frozen foods, S.S. Pierce was the top name in canned groceries. They marketed everything in all top quality, sold only the best groceries, and West Hartford had a company-owned store, unquote. We went by this all the time. My sister went to a school in Farmington, just the next town over, and my parents would always stop there to buy her provisions in case the school didn't serve enough chocolate. But one thing you might actually think is, what are the unique things they actually served? Well, how about a tall, cool glass of Honegger from S.S. Pierce? Not only was it refreshing, but Honegger, which is a mixture of honey and apple cider vinegar, is very similar to Switchell. Honey and vinegar mixtures such as oxymeal have been used for purported health benefits since ancient times. The name Honegger was used by D.C. Jarvis in his book Folk Medicines, A Vermont Doctor's Guide to Good Health. Well, Honegger is exactly what it sounds like, a mix of equal parts of honey and apple cider vinegar. But you had to wear your mink cape to buy it. Well, by the 1960s, they were actually serving cream, salmon, and peas in a can. Now, this was different than the other one. This was a smaller can. And the tradition of serving salmon and peas on the 4th of July is an old New England tradition. These were things that, yes, saved time, saved preparation, simply heated them over a double boiler, and they were available to eat. But during the 1960s, the company began to make forays into frozen food. This was a hit-or-miss thing. How long do you freeze it? How long can it be kept frozen? And was it edible if it had been frozen? Well, seen here, Joe and Tom Keneally on the left-hand side are seen presenting S.S. Pierce Company with the best frozen steaks in the world. In the 1960s, frozen food was marketed by the company, and it became quite popular. It's edifying to know that Keneally Meats is still going strong decades later. You would buy a box of steaks, usually 4, frozen, and of course they could be kept until you wanted to use them. Now, I lived in Milton for many years, and we just bought a house the other day to return. And the idea is Keneally Meats is served in the Milton marketplace. One steak usually is about $75. So I wonder what these frozen steaks were really like. But see, here was Norman Pierce, who served as, Peirce, who served as vice president of the SS Pierce and headed the frozen food division, and served food by his daughter, Adele Pierce, that was prepared by Julia Child, who worked at SS Pierce, creating appetizing dishes for both canned as well as frozen dishes. He himself not only headed up the frozen food division, but he was a wine connoisseur as well. And on the lower right-hand side, it says frozen foods available at the SS Pierce store, which was quite extensive. In that way, they had many different people that would cook and, of course, write about it in newspapers and magazines. One woman who actually was employed by SS Pierce was Julia Child, and she introduced French cuisine to the American public with her cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and her subsequent television program, The French Chef, which premiered in 1963 in Boston's WGBH television. She graduated from Le Cordon Bleu, and her articles for the Epicure of the 1960s used Pierce's canned and frozen foods as conveniences that could be transformed into gourmet dinners. She suggested Pierce's cream of curry soup, quote, with additional cream and a garnish of cucumber, unquote. Salmon casserole made with Pierce's canned salmon, mixed with cream cheese, sliced hard-boiled eggs, and grated Swiss cheese, and then heated until bubbling. As she said, bon appetit. But she did write a series of articles until she finally did have her WGBH program. Some of their spirits were incredible. They served a variety of rum, but SS Pierce's Cruzan Gold Label rum was the finest rum they served. This was distilled and shipped by St. Croix Sugarcane Industries, St. Croix, West Indies. Not only was it potent, but it was something that led the rums that they offered. They also bottled wines and liquors for even places like the Country Club. Founded in 1882 and located in Brookline, the Country Club is one of the oldest clubs in the United States and one of the 5 charter members that founded the United States Golf Association in 1894. SS Pierce would import Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey and bottle it for the club. Affixing a label showed that it was 90 proof. It's still available. They have shiploads of it in the basement of the club. And they also offered SS Pierce's different whiskeys. 4 great whiskeys of the world, bourbon, Scotch, Canadian, and Irish, come from the house of Pierce. It says it's a matter of good taste. So whether you imported wines from Europe or you even brought in wonderful things like rum from the Caribbean or the West Indies, or even Madeira from Madeira, you began to realize your guests were quite impressed. They also had these wonderful tin serving trays. I like it, but I would never use it. It said that they were wine and spirit merchants since 1831, and directly around the side with these horses shows that they served Overland, Booths, Glengarry, and Hennessy. These were things that were not only important, but it showed the breadth of the things that were available. Well, by 1955, SS Pierce & Company was grossing $35 million annually, and 2 years later, there were over 300 members of the Quarter Century Club, which was phenomenal as the company was family-owned and operated by 4 generations of the Pierce family. The people that ran the company, Samuel Silman Pierce, Wallace Lincoln Pierce, Walworth Pierce, Roger Preston, the first non-family member, Wallace Lincoln Pierce, the second, Roger Dwight Williams, related but a different name, and the company was sold to Seneca Foods in 1973. During the period between 1831 and 1973, this was something that not only Bostonians knew, but they had clients across the world. There was one woman who lived in Florence. She lived as late as 1912. She was the oldest customer from 1831, and she would actually receive this whole aspect of a basket twice a year. You also saw people taking ships, or maybe even taking the train to Bangor, Maine. S.S. Pierce, by this period, not only had provided a series of different things, but they were highly competitive. We saw S.S. Pierce, Star Market, and many others competing with less costly interpretations of their goods. S.S. Pierce couldn't compete, and eventually we realized people actually shopped there for treats or special items. It was no longer something they stacked their entire house with. So by the period of the 1970s, though the name was extremely well known, and today we can still purchase S.S. Pierce Manhattan Mix as well as Martini, it's something in a lot of ways that has gone down in history. It truly was a magnificent company, and it provided wonderful gourmet items that many of us probably remember quite well. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.